experiences. They did a study related to spontaneous experiences and how they relate to psi. And so please, welcome Jennifer.
Thank you. Oh, I can hear the microphone's working. Okay. So the topic of my talk is the frequencies of psi experiences and entity encounters in spontaneously reported self-transcendent experiences. So that's a lot of words. And I know that maybe some of you are not familiar with all of those constructs. So I'll begin by sort of describing them, the relevant ones. I just want to say that I did this project with my students, my undergraduate students, and in terms of, people have mentioned education and the importance of education with respect to the issues that we're talking about here. I have taught an undergraduate course for 20 years. It's been full every single semester. Undergraduates want to know and they want to be involved, and so I'm never at a loss for research assistance. So to begin with, to define self-transcendent experiences, this is a new word for an old concept. The original idea, I think, was described by William James in his 1902, The Varieties of Religious Experience. It was originally called, he originally called them mystical experiences. He was focusing on the experiences that people sometimes have where they feel lifted out of themselves. They feel like they have transcended their separate sense of self and their ego. And he delineated these 4 characteristics that he thought defined mystical experiences. So I'll just describe what those are, so in case you haven't had a mystical experience, you'll get the feel for it. The noetic quality of a mystical experience is a sense of understanding or insight, the sort of, like the aha experience that we sometimes have, even though it's not necessarily mystical. In these cases, people feel like they grasp reality differently, more fundamentally than they did previously. There's an element of ineffability, meaning that people have trouble describing these experiences in words. So it's happened, but they can't quite get a verbal grip on it and explain it sufficiently to other people. They usually entail an element of passivity, that is, they come on the person sort of unexpectedly. There are practices which will allow people to sort of make them more likely, like meditation and such as that, but in general, they sort of occur just spontaneously to people. And then finally, transiency is the fact that unfortunately, they don't tend to last. That may not be true in a few cases, but in general, they are fleeting, they're brief, they come and they go. Since 1902, there has been sort of a movement to demystify mystical experiences, and sort of like the talk we were hearing earlier today, kind of unspiritualize them. So they are now actually currently called in the literature self-transcendent experiences, and people who have gone on to refine the definition have included other elements like a dramatic sense of change in self, or change in time, or change in space. So if you put all those things together, it ends up encompassing a very wide range of experiences, but these are very personally important experiences, and the impact of a self-transcendent experience can last for years. So I'll just give you an example from this is a case from our research, and I'll read it just because I know sometimes it's hard to read depending where you are in the room. I was pumping a bucket of water from the pump in our backyard. We did not have plumbing. I was not meditating nor doing anything to cause an altered state of consciousness. My eye fell on an ordinary weed growing beside the pump, and I suddenly was filled with awe because of its perfect beauty. I felt I was for the first time seeing it as it really was, and that I had never really perceived the reality of it before. I felt a certainty that everything in all creation possessed this beauty and perfection, if only we saw it as it really is. I was filled with joy. This lasted only an instant, and then things were ordinary as before, as if the sun had come from behind the clouds for an instant and then was gone, leaving all in gloom again. This is actually the shortest case in our database, and so that's one reason it's useful. But it's also useful because it has these elements of a classic mystical or self-transcendent experience. I was suddenly filled communicates the passivity. Awe and beauty and joy are all elements that people commonly experience in these states. I felt a certainty, sort of communicates the noetic quality. There's something That person knows in this situation that they don't usually, and it lasted only an instant. So, there's a very wide variety, but this at least illustrates some of the components of a self-transcendent experience. So with respect to psi and entity encounters, I think at this point everybody knows what psi is. It's what people outside this room call the paranormal. And so it encompasses a variety of experiences that are difficult to explain with our ordinary understanding of physical principles as they operate at our usual level of awareness. Entity encounters is maybe somewhat less familiar. Entities is a deliberately ambiguous term that is intended to refer to a wide variety of beings that people experience in altered states that can, be interpreted a number of different ways. So, for example, in our research, angels, dead relatives, apparitions, aliens, anything that, people might see as an independent conscious agent that they're experiencing, that they are not experiencing as something that is an extension of themselves. They are not seeing it as their own hallucination or their own projection. They're experiencing it as an independent entity. So we were interested in those, and I'll just note that we left God and Jesus out of this because they come up so often that we had to limit it somehow. So God and Jesus are a separate issue. So here's just an excerpt from a transcendent experience involving these elements. I was welcomed by angels praising me, knowing me, waiting for me. They were greeting me in Arab language. The peace and mercy of God should be on you. I didn't exchange any word during this experience. Everything was done from mind to mind, instantly, difficult to explain. So here, this is a good excerpt because we've got both elements here. The angels are entities, and the communication is mind-to-mind, experienced telepathically. So this is an example of somebody who was having a transcendent experience that involved both of those elements. So the method that we used, we actually did a content analysis of 236 cases. These are self-reported cases that people volunteer, they just spontaneously put up on the internet. Turns out people will put anything on the internet. And we got them from a variety of websites, so they were not coming from all one place. We had limited information, demographic information, but some websites do collect that, so we had at least a way to estimate, and we could tell where they were all coming from. So we know they come from at least 16 countries. But the other demographic information is limited. The majority of people who posted these are female, average age 28. But again, there's always some ambiguity about when did the experience happen relative to when is the person posting it and what age are we getting from the website. In any case, they describe self-transcendent experiences that occurred in a variety of contexts. So lots of precursors, dreams, drugs, and so on, prayer, meditation. The hypnagogic state, if you don't know, is that state where you're falling asleep, where lots of weird things happen. Near death, out of body, and so on. So we did collect information about all the precursors, and that's one of the interesting aspects of this is that self-transcendent experiences, as they are broadly defined, occur under lots of conditions. So we had a 65-item rating scale, which we developed as we were reading these cases, that tried to identify the elements that occurred in multiple cases. So from the precursors to emotional effects, cognitive effects, after effects, and so on. So for example, did the person experience oneness, unity, or connection to the universe in general, would be sort of a typical element that might define it as a self-transcendent experience. Did the person encounter someone they knew who was dead? So that's where we get the information about entities and so on. And so I and my students each rated these cases on a 1 to 5 scale because we just were stuck with static text. We had to look through the text and decide whether or not this element was present or not in the text. So for example, if the person says, I just smoked a lot of marijuana before this happened, then we would say, yes, they were using drugs. But, so yes was 5, 1 was no, or they didn't mention it. And then there was some ambiguity where you can't really tell. So the person says they were relaxing in bed, then they have this experience. Were they dreaming? We don't know, So there's a middle ground that we were trying to incorporate using a Likert scale. So each each experience was rated at least twice, and sometimes more than that, because we were going for maximum reliability. And we did get a Cronbach's alpha of greater than 0.7, which for some of you, it means that we had adequate inter-rater reliability. But we also used a criteria that if raters were farther than 2 points apart on any item for the 65 items on the Likert scale, then we'd go back and look at it and try to figure out whether or not we could rate that. So in the end, we averaged scores so that we would get one set of scores for each case, and then that's the data that we used for the analysis. So with respect to psi experiences overall, 14% of the self-transcendent experiences involved them. You probably can't read those numbers, so I'll read them to you. There were 6.8% involved clairvoyance of some kind, 6.4% involved precognition, 3% telepathy, and no experiences of psychokinesis. So the reason those don't add up to 14% is because in some cases there was more than one psi experience in the same self-transcendent experience. With respect to entities, there were 19.1% of the cases overall involved entities, with 11.1% being angels, spirit guides, some spiritual figure, again, not God or Jesus. And then 6.8% were another kind of being, which was kind of our default category, because there was a very wide variety. There was rats, and there were light beings, and there were people doing work, and there was a wide range of other elements that we couldn't really clearly categorize. 5.1% were people that the person already knew were dead already, and then 2.6 ghosts or apparitions. So it just gives us an idea that they're not uncommon elements of self-transcendent experiences. So in conclusion, what we essentially found is that both psi and entity encounters are elements of a substantial minority of self-transcendent experiences, and they haven't really been investigated to find out the prevalence of those experiences within this category of altered state. So that was something. However, it's a little sort of underwhelming to some extent, because we would expect that, given what we think about what facilitates both psi and entity experiences. For example, Michael Falburn in 2006 proposed what he calls the filter theory, but he's just one person who has proposed a specific theory that serves the same purpose. He suggested that psychologically there are people who have thin boundaries. That is, the distinction between their conscious and unconscious is somewhat permeable, and so information can transfer more easily from the unconscious to the conscious in people with thin boundaries. So what that would predict psychologically is that there are people who would be more likely to experience all kinds of altered states, because if part of the experience of altered states is having access to some part of your awareness that you don't usually have access to, that's part of the definition of a self-transcendent experience, is you're going beyond your usual mode of experiencing. Therefore, wouldn't you then sometimes have access to these other elements? Similarly, psi phenomena and transcendent experiences need to be explained together, and this one paper that argues for this is Marshall's from 2011. And again, that's sort of a no-brainer, because contemplative traditions have known forever that if you intentionally alter your focus of your attention and intentionally move yourself out of your ordinary awareness, then psi experiences and entity encounters are something that naturally happens on the path of that practice. So Marshall and many other people have said we cannot just take out these psi and entity encounter experiences and pretend that there's something separate from other altered states. So that's kind of where we're left with theoretically. So this blob over here on your right is a mess, And it's supposed to be like that because I think that actually represents reality. I think reality is a mess, and what we're trying to do is artificially separate it out and say, oh no, this is a group of experiences that is separate from this group of experiences, and the people in OBEs never talk to the people who are talking, dealing with dreams and so on. But my impression, at least from this database and from other research, is that it all overlaps, and that there's a common mechanism somewhere, which I guess is what we're trying to get at, that facilitates all kinds of altered states and unusual experiences. And so for self-transcendent experiences, they can be facilitated by all these precursors, and they can involve both of these elements. And as we have access to larger and larger numbers of cases, all we do is see more and more variety in people's experiences. This has happened in other areas of altered states as well, such as the near-death experiences research done by Sam Parnia that was published in 2014, the AWARE study where he had several hundred people who had recovered from cardiac arrest. And one of his findings was that there's a much larger variability to people's experiences in near-death states than just Raymond Moody's lights and tunnels and dead relatives. So I think that as we get into all of these states and sort of have access to more and more information, especially because of the internet, we're going to get a more complicated picture perhaps than we would like to have, because it makes dealing with these phenomena that much more difficult. I've done the same thing with DMT entity experiences. Everybody thinks everybody gets machine elves because Terence McKenna said machine elves. That's not what everybody gets. They get all kinds of things. So another important point, I think, is that it's important to remember that the qualitative data of people's direct experience has to remain fundamental, because I think that that's what we're trying to explain anyway. And so for me personally, it's helpful to start with somebody's description of their experience. It's also useful to come at it from the other direction and do more controlled scientific experiments, but at least from the psychological perspective, that's the fundamental data, is what people say they experienced. So just a last couple things. First of all, obviously there are pretty limiting factors to this study, primarily the lack of information. We couldn't interview people, we couldn't follow up, we couldn't say, what did you mean by that? That we just had static written text. On the other hand, they were also spontaneously reported, and so this is people's best description of what they experienced when they're not talking to anybody in particular, they're just putting it out there. So there's always the problem of self-report. People misremember things. We don't know how long it was since the experience occurred. But if nothing else, we're getting what was important to them, even if it's years after the experience occurred and is still meaningful. And then finally, there were certainly cases where we needed to sort of use a little literary interpretation and kind of understand the inference that they were trying to communicate with what they communicated. And so those limitations will only be resolved as we gather more data, and if we could follow it up and find a sample of people who are willing to actually be interviewed in person. So in the future, our goal is to expand the database. We already have, to some extent, we're up to more like 350 cases at this point. So as we gather more cases and we do the same analysis on them, we're going to be narrowing our confidence interval about what the actual prevalence is for psi experiences and entity encounters overall, what our best guess is. But really, we're actually aiming to use this database for more than just that, to see whether we can, now that I've just said it's impossible, see whether we can separate out the kinds of experiences people have under different circumstances. Is a transcendent experience in an out-of-body experience different than one that occurs under hypnosis? Or, can we reliably distinguish between them? And ultimately, in the next several months, I hope, we will have enough cases in order to actually factor analyze and get some characteristics of the main elements of what a self-transcendent experience actually involves. So that's our goal, and that's where we are at with it right now. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jennifer. I want to compliment you on your staying within the time limit.
know.
You're very good at it. Christopher.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Jennifer. Very exciting that people feel compelled to share these things online in an anonymous way, right?
Right.
Were any of them on message boards where people are conversing about them?
No, they're more like posted to the site.
Right.
And then, sometimes they will add like a little note, like if anybody knows what's going on, please help, kind of thing. But so far we haven't looked at listservs where there's a back and forth.
And one sub-question to that, in the experiences, were people talking at all about long-term effects after these self-transcendent
Well,
experiences?
this is something that I didn't mention, but is consistent with what we know about these kinds of experiences, is that they are impactful for a very long time. And the only anecdotal information I can give you about that is that in some cases they do say when this happened to them. They were 14 and now they're 60 and they're still thinking about it. Right. So that's definitely in there, and at some point we'll be able to separate out those cases and say, look how long these people have been thinking about this. Great. So yes, that happens.
Thank you.
What percentage, if any, could be considered UFO or alien related?
Not very many, except for the drug-induced ones. So,
okay.
I can't give you exact numbers, but it does definitely seem like, DMT seems to bring on the aliens.
Okay.
And it's less likely to happen under other circumstances, although out of body sometimes, once in a while.
Could be, oh, I see. Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
So.
Did I understand correctly that you've done essentially all of your data gathering by harvesting posts from the internet, from various websites?
That's correct.
How much confidence do you have that these are actually honest self-reports and not just exercises in creative fiction writing?
None, but but it's the best we can do. So it's that sort of situation where, nobody knows that we're taking these cases off of the internet. So I don't know why people post things there anyway. I mean, that would be a whole separate study and we could compare it to people who would just say things to you in person. But no, I have no way of knowing whether or not somebody just decided they were going to write this up as their own short story and leave it at that.
Hey, thank you. I wanted to ask, did you find that a relatively consistent feature of the experiences that you studied was a kind of self-contradiction, but not necessarily in a way that makes the experience less credible, but would gesture toward the ineffability of the experience as felt by the people reporting? For instance, I noticed in one of your slides, there's the example of the woman who felt like she was being telepathically communicated with, but also said that the beings were talking in Arabic. Mm-hmm. So,
well,
kind of
I think that's a good example of it. It's not very common, and especially with respect to that little excerpt, I will say that I think there's a subset of these cases who may be actively psychotic as they're writing them. And just clinically speaking, it sort of sounds that way to me. And that's one of the elements that we rate. There are people who seem like they are further out of touch with sort of our ordinary reality than others. And so but the other element with respect to that particular excerpt is I think sometimes they are struggling to try to communicate what they experienced, and so it does perhaps sometimes end up sounding contradictory.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to just follow up on your opinion. York obviously asked a good question, but I think the maybe more pertinent question is what might be defined using what you intuitively sense as truth or wisdom. What is your impression about, I guess, the authenticity of the feel of the accounts you found online?
It actually, personally, reading through them is, inspiring. What it actually comes across is that people are agonizing about what to make of this, that there is so little discussion of spontaneous, transcendent experiences in our culture that, one of our questions is, did they feel like they were going insane because it comes up so often? So actually, I mean, there's the possibility that some percentage of them are fraudulent or something, but that is not my impression having read through them.
And I assume also then that intuitively that you sense or feel a commonality of authenticity, so that in spite of the variation, that there are common themes that kind of resonate with you, having gone through as many as you have. Is that?
Right, and it ends up being a lot like William James suggested, and include the general sense of being able to get beyond your ordinary perspective seems to be the thing that comes through.
Right, thank you.
No, we don't, actually. Thank you very much, Jennifer. Please.